We are 11 days away from the US elections. Meanwhile, we also find ourselves in the middle of Global Media and Information Literacy Week. If you're like me, you've also struggled from time to time with the concept of truth in the era of misinformation. Let me be clear, I'm not buying into conspiracy theories, but I have wrestled with the fact that we seem to be living in different worlds where for some COVID was very real, and for others a hoax. Where in each season I'm witnessing the catastrophic effects of climate change, but others seems to think that it is Biden commanding the storms. So I did what we should all be doing when struggling with the truth. I turned to an expert.
A lot of the things that we're dealing with today are very much in the realm of truth versus false. Conspiracy theories do not have to be indulged on and on and on. And I think that the role of the misinformers is to sow doubt about the truth-seeking process itself. If nothing is true, if nothing can be determined, I mean, that only advantages those who are trying to assert power, often through misinformation.
Angie Drobnic Holan is the director of the International Fact-Checking Network and has been working as a fact-checker for almost 20 years. Her community has been under harsh scrutiny during the US presidential elections, regardless of what they choose to do. To fact-check or not to fact-check seems to be the question.
We're seeing more self-policing reaction where some of the journalists are deciding to fact-check more, fact-check less. This has been especially true in TV interviews where the journalists have to decide how much they're going to fact-check. And there have been surreal conversations where Donald Trump has said he doesn't want to do interviews if he's going to be fact-checked, which to me, it's like you're not really being interviewed by a journalist if they're not allowed to comment on truth or falsity. I mean, that to me, that is a very kind of bonkers situation that we've ended up in.
But for Angie, the answer is crystal clear.
And I want to be very clear here. I do not think any journalist should ever negotiate away their right to fact check for interview access. To me, that's a huge ethical breach. I just think that journalists' duty is to fact check and they cannot negotiate that away.
From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Villanova. Today on the show, fact-checking in the era of misinformation. Where does the job of the fact-checker end? And where do we go from here? Here's my conversation with Angie Drobnic Holan, the director of the International Fact-Checking Network. Angie, hello and welcome to Policy Voices. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really wanted to speak with you today, not only because, the US elections are really, really fast approaching, but also we find ourselves during the Global Media and Information Literacy Week. And you've been working as a fact checker for almost 2 decades now. First, you were the editor-in-chief of PolitiFact for a decade, and for a year now, you've been working as a director of the International Fact-Checking Network. I'm really curious to know how has your work evolved since you started working in this field and until now. It's been almost 2 decades. What would you say were the biggest trends, the biggest evolutions?
It's really interesting because in a lot of ways, the fact-checking work itself hasn't changed. We're still dealing with verification, primary sources, putting information in context. But in other ways, the information ecosystem has changed dramatically. And I would say the way it's changed the most is volume and speed. There's so much more information. There are more social networks. News stories develop very rapidly and are frequently followed almost instantaneously by misinformation. And we see that with all sorts of news events. So when I started fact checking, I think the field was more policy oriented. It was more interested in explaining issues affecting voters and elections. So healthcare, economics, foreign policy. And this is a little bit subjective, but I think there was more civility. I think people were more open to the idea that they might be wrong. I think that there was more of a desire to seek compromise across the political spectrum when it comes to formulating policies. And in the 20 years since I started, I think we've seen more political polarization. There's a lot more emotions around in-groups and out-groups. And again, with the flourishing of information on the internet, we do really see this fracturing of the public discussion. And I think all those things have made the work of fact checking more challenging.
I want to ask you now to take our listeners into the world of a fact checker. I think it's very clear what the work of a journalist is, but maybe also during the campaign now, fact checkers came into the spotlight not for the most positive reasons, but they came into the spotlight nonetheless. So I do think that your work in the work of fact checkers nowadays is really prominent, but perhaps there's still some confusion amongst the general public about what fact checkers actually do. And I read an opinion article that you wrote earlier this year, where you also debunked this myth that links fact checking with censorship. So it even in some people's minds they even put these two connected. So what is it actually that you do? How do you go about doing your work?
The fact checking community that I work with is a group of journalists who are dedicated to writing reports that either verify or debunk information. And that information can come from political candidates who are running for office, or it can come from memes shared on social media, or it can come from anywhere. And the idea behind the fact checking report is that the journalist explains what was said and whether it's true or not. And they provide evidence. The evidence is very key because we want people to be able to replicate the findings of fact checkers. So the fact checkers are not holding themselves out as authorities or experts in and of themselves, but they're saying, here's the best evidence that we were able to find, explained in common everyday language for non-experts, and the public will hopefully be better informed at the end of reading a fact check. And the fact check also makes a promise to get to the bottom of the matter. So if there's something where it's a confusing issue, or there's evidence on both sides, or it's hard to tell what the real story is, the fact check will either reach no conclusion or perhaps it won't be published. Now, the claims of censorship have arisen because when social media came on the scene around 2007 and started gaining popularity over the next decade, misinformation really found a place to flourish. But most people do not like being fooled. They do not want to log on to their Facebook account or their WhatsApp or their Twitter, now X account, and be flooded with hoaxes, conspiracy theories, viral content that's false. So a few of the platforms, not all of them, but a few of them started programs working with fact checkers where the fact checkers corrected misinformation, and then that misinformation was downgraded from going viral. But some of the people who liked the messages in the misinformation didn't like this, and they said this is censorship. It's not censorship for a few reasons. Most of these programs, the fact checks are simply labels on content, so content isn't removed. In some cases where content might be removed, it's the decision of the social media platform to run its site the way it sees fit. And there are other guidelines on social media that can cause information to be removed. Sometimes it's not about fact checking at all. It's about community guidelines, such as, like, a good example would be during the COVID-19 pandemic, the social media companies had totally separate policies apart from fact checking about removing content. So the fact checkers have had to deal with this label as censors, but I don't think it's a fair or accurate label because we believe that fact checking adds to the public debate by giving people additional information.
Do you see your work as ending with the fact checking? So what I have in mind is conspiracy theories such as climate change not being real, the 2020 election was stolen. When you're going about doing your work with a certain narrative and a certain view of the world that is fundamentally different and at odds with someone else's, do you see your job and your work to changing people's minds, or you work on specific claims, specific numbers, specific facts, and your job is to just either to debunk or say, okay, no, that's actually correct?
That is such a great question. And the honest answer is that different fact checkers have different opinions about this. So I think the thing that fact checkers have in common is this adherence to high standards, to providing evidence so that people can replicate findings, consulting experts, There's a commitment within our international fact checking network to nonpartisanship. But the question of impact is what you're raising. And some of the fact checkers take a real hands off approach where they say, we just want to leave the facts out there and let our audience decide for themselves. We are not active in policy. We're not seeking any sort of corrections. And then other fact checkers are quite different and they do seek corrections. And one of the best examples of this is Full Fact in the United Kingdom. It's a very interesting fact checking website where they do seek corrections, not only from media outlets, but from members of parliament as well. And they have a whole policy program. And this is where we're getting into new types of journalism and new types of media. And what is the role of the journalist as someone who stands up for truth? Is it enough to simply put out your report and say, there, we have explained the truth and now people can understand it? Or do you go farther? And some of the fact checkers do want to see a more active approach to getting truthful information out there. It's a complicated question. I'm not sure that there's a right answer for every context. Some of these things are very culturally specific and have to do with like the media cultures of individual countries. But I do think it's a question that fact checkers have to grapple with.
I think you can expect the question the follow-up question that I'm going to ask you now. But where do you stand on this debate?
I think it's really hard. I am sympathetic to the model of seeking corrections, but I also think that people don't like to be told what to think. So I do think that the ethical commitment of the fact checker and of the journalist is first to truth, not to policy outcomes. So I don't know. I guess I'm still mulling it. Right now, I tend to think that we don't, the truth is so contested in this era. I think one of journalism's key strengths is, as I said, that ethical commitment to truth first before like your side winning or making someone look good or bad. I think journalism is one of the knowledge professions that does have this ethical commitment to truth first. And I don't think we should do anything to sacrifice that. That's where I'm at right now. But I am still watching the discussion and I'm open-minded.
Can we even speak of truth anymore in this era? I mean, of course, I do believe we do see the world in a very similar lens. But when you are engaging, with people that you and I call conspiracy theorists, that again believe COVID is a hoax, that the election was stolen, truth, it almost becomes a meaningless concept because we just hold to our beliefs and what we see as truth in such a way that we are not letting go. And putting myself in their position, if they believe what I believe with the same conviction that I do, then how can there even be a conversation anymore?
Yeah, I think truth still has a lot of power in it. I'm not ready to concede any sort of relativity when it comes to truth. I mean, obviously, there are some ideas that are like the meaning of life or spirituality that cannot be proved with evidence. The love a mother has for a child is not something that requires evidence or proof or rationality. But I think a lot of the things that we're dealing with today are very much in the realm of truth versus false. That things can be proven. Conspiracy theories do not have to be indulged on and on and on because there may be, maybe the moon landing was faked. How do you know? I mean, I think there is a lot more robust truth in the world right now than we commonly give it credit for. And I think that the role of the misinformers is to sow doubt about the truth seeking process itself. If nothing is true, if nothing can be determined, I mean, that only advantages those who are trying to assert power, often through misinformation. So I wouldn't concede the factuality of truth or the evidence seeking process to anybody. I think there's still a lot of power in that.
In your job as the director of International Fact Checking Network, part of your job description is no more to go about debunking and fact checking specific claims and facts. But I'm really curious to hear from you what has been the most outrageous claim, fact, lie that or your team have debunked?
Well, I think on a global scale, some of the claims that climate change isn't happening continue to be outrageous. I know those are common claims, and probably everyone listening has heard those claims, but I do think that the claims arguing that climate change isn't real or is somehow a hoax remain very harmful and, to me, are outrageous. In the United States, the claims of election fraud from 2020 are very outrageous. That election was conducted freely and fairly. And I think every independent journalist and the vast majority of the court cases have found that the United States elections in 2020 were conducted fairly. And then there's a lot of hoaxes and conspiracy theories around the world about outgroups like immigrants and hate speech that are fairly outrageous. I mean, I think every time I travel to visit fact checkers and we have conferences or discuss about the fact checks we're seeing, we're always seeing hate messages around outgroups. And it depends on like where you are and who is the outgroup. Sometimes it's a certain religion, sometimes it's a certain race, sometimes it's immigrants. That's very common. So those are the kinds of like outrageous false claims that we see transplanted around the world.
Absolutely. And in Europe, we are seeing that at an alarming rate, to the extent that perhaps a narrative that has started within social media is now being translated into policy. To, for example, Germany choosing to close borders, to Italy choosing to outsource migration to Albania, and so on and so on. It's definitely something that we in Europe are very familiar with. As you know, the United States and European Union, we have a very different approach when it comes to freedom of speech. In the United States, it's almost freedom of speech above all else, whereas in Europe we take a different approach. So, for example, in Germany, there are certain laws that prohibit people to speak openly with claims against that the Holocaust denialism, or with pro-Nazism slogans, etc. So we do put other values ahead of freedom of speech. And I was wondering if for you, fact checking is a way of squaring the circle around protecting free speech while maintaining or making sure that the public is not being deliberately misinformed.
I think that is actually a very good way of putting it. I became interested in fact checking. I was a daily newspaper journalist and I really loved journalism and reporting, but I was often unsatisfied that it didn't seem to quite get at the bottom line of what was true or not. So I became a fact checker because I wanted to know what the real story was. I wanted to dig deeper to find out what was actually going on. And I do think freedom of expression is a key part of the fact checking process. I mean, you have to be able to look into unpopular ideas. You have to be able to interview anybody who seems relevant. There's a common expression in the United States that the antidote to bad speech is more speech. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think that often is true. But I also think that we're grappling with information overload because it's clear that you can flood human attention with so much speech that they can't comprehend it all. So I do think in the United States, we are going through kind of a reflection process of what does freedom of speech mean in the internet age when there's so much information and people can kind of create their own information realities. Like, what does that mean? And I don't think the answer is ever going to be censorship, but I do think that we need to think about ways to empower truthful information and to at least say if information is false, it's not given a leg up or an advantage on going viral. I mean, I think that's what we've seen in some of these early days of the internet, that false information actually was advantaged over truthful information because it played on people's emotions. It garnered attention because of its shocking false nature. And I do think that ecosystems of information need to think about that dynamic in ways to reduce it because, again, public surveys show most people want truthful information. They do not want this free for all where you never know if what you're looking at is true or not. And as we've had different technologies in human history, people have had to grapple with that and think of ways to produce knowledge that's truthful and to downgrade knowledge that's false. So we're in the middle of that process right now.
You have a very consequential election coming up. How are you feeling about that?
I think most Americans are ready for it to be done, but there's several more days to go. It's been very dramatic. One of the candidates has a track record of saying things that are false, and it's been really hard for fact checkers in the US to deal with the public perception of fact checking, that it's nonpartisan, that it's independent. When one of the candidates is so asymmetrical with saying things that are false, it is presenting a lot of challenges to fact checkers specifically, but I think to all of American journalism more generally. And we're seeing different journalists navigate that in different ways.
Exactly. Fact checkers, they've been coming under the spotlight during the presidential campaign and specifically during the debates where their work was absolutely essential. How is the community living through this? Does it even feel safe conducting their work when it's being under attack by one of the camps?
I think that the safety levels for American journalists are still thankfully pretty good. I think there's a lot of harsh criticism, but I think it's hard for me to think of any fact checkers that are not safe. And some of the journalism organizations have had to take extra steps to increase online safety or to increase security. But I think we're seeing more kind of a self policing reaction where some of the journalists are deciding to fact check more, fact check less. This has been especially true in TV interviews like debates or town halls, where the journalists have to decide how much they're going to fact check. And that's like we've seen journalists handle it different ways. And there have been surreal conversations where Donald Trump has said he doesn't want to do interviews if he's going to be fact checked, which, I mean, to me, it's like, well, you're not really being interviewed by a journalist if they're not allowed to comment on truth or falsity. I mean, that to me, that is a very kind of bonkers situation that we've ended up in. And I want to be very clear here. I do not think any journalist should ever negotiate away their right to fact check for interview access. To me, that's a huge ethical breach. I just think that journalists' duty is to fact check and they cannot negotiate that away.
Absolutely. I have one final question, maybe of I don't know, a grabble after everything we talked about. Do you think that Trump is responsible for creating this area of misinformation where we find ourselves in? I mean, for the good or for the bad, there's no one else like him. Or do you think the stage was already set for him that allowed him to create these narratives and these lies as he wants? I think my wishful thinking, if it is just him, maybe I'm just hoping that if he doesn't get reelected and if he just, disappears from the spotlight, then everything will go back to normal. But is that even possible? Is that the case?
I don't think things are going back to normal. I think we may have a new normal that we'll get to eventually. I also don't think that Trump created these conditions. I think he is very much someone who's taken advantage of the environment that he found. Now, he is unique in his personality, in his background as a television performer. He was a celebrity before he ever ran for president. And I think that gave him some advantages that more traditional politicians don't have. I think there are things that are very unique to Trump, but I also think that there were a lot of conditions set of this openness to conspiracy theories in the Republican Party that we saw to some extent during John McCain's 2008 campaign against Barack Obama. We certainly were fact checking lots of conspiracy theories. And it's not that the left doesn't have conspiracy theories, they do. There's nothing about political outlook that makes someone more vulnerable to conspiracy theories or not. But the parties do tend to develop political cultures. So I would say I have the hope that the Republican Party can address some of these things. And from time to time, we see pushback within the party. We are in an asymmetrical situation right now, but that's not necessarily a long-term dynamic or something that can't change. So what will happen after this election? It's hard to say. We're at a very, very interesting historical moment. But I do know that journalism needs to be on the side of truth. And I do think our nonpartisanship and our independence are key strengths as well. So I would never want to see those sacrificed either.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for leaving us with that message. And Angie, best of luck in this final stretch until the elections. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
That was Angie Drobnic Holan, the director of the International Fact-Checking Network. If you want to comment on this episode, you can search for Friends of Europe on LinkedIn and X or send us an email. Our address is press@friendsofeurope.org. As always, don't forget to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you're listening to this now to never miss an episode of Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Villanova and I'll be with you again next week. Until then, goodbye.